Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Friday the 21st of February in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, the United States signals sanctions on Russia are a bargaining chip in talks over ending the Ukraine war.
The US Treasury Secretary tells Bloomberg any move to boost longer-term debt isn't imminent as investors start to consider Trump's ideas for the Treasury market.
Plus, it's been 30 years since Nick Leeson caused the collapse of Barings Bank. The former rogue trader tells us why he's worried about the UK's push to deregulate.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The United States says sanctions on Russia are on the negotiating table in the talks to end the war in Ukraine. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told Bloomberg the White House is prepared to either ramp up or ease penalties on Moscow as negotiations progress. He also continued the administration's criticism of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky.
I think President Zelensky, unfortunately, escalated and has put some daylight between.
How did he escalate?
A lot of his remarks in Munich, I thought were inappropriate. President Zelensky, when I met with him, assured me that he'd be signing the minerals deal in Munich. He has not.
Scott Bessent there speaking to Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern. America's change in tone on Ukraine has affected talks among the group of 7 nations. Countries are struggling to agree on a draft communiqué to mark 3 years since Russia's invasion, after the US objected to references to Russia's war of aggression.
The US Treasury Secretary also told Bloomberg that plans to boost the amount of long-term debt the US issues are a long way off. Bessent has repeatedly criticised his predecessor Janet Yellen for favouring short-term debt to fund the US economy. But the Treasury Secretary says that rebalancing will take time.
That's a long way off. And we're going to see what the market wants. The Fed said that they may stop their balance sheet runoff. So, easier for me to extend duration when I'm not competing with another big seller. It's going to be path dependent.
Bessent also dismissed recent market speculation that the government might revalue its holdings of gold to reduce US borrowing needs. The Treasury Secretary also added that cost savings from Elon Musk's Doge efficiency drive should help bring down spending.
Wall Street is starting to look seriously at plans to overhaul the Treasuries market drawn up by President Trump's advisers. One concept, dubbed the Mar-a-Lago Accord, would involve forcing foreign creditors to swap their Treasuries into 100-year non-tradable zero-coupon bonds. And this would ease the US's debt burden. Market veteran Jim Bianco made it the focus of his client call this week. The founder of Bianco Research said if Trump is bold enough to put NATO in jeopardy, he's bold enough to do the same with the foundation of the financial system. Bond investors are so far showing little sign of concern, with trading in the Treasury market particularly calm in recent days.
Federal Reserve policymaker Alberto Musalem sees a growing risk of inflation stalling above the Fed's 2% target or moving higher. Speaking at the Economic Club of New York, the St. Louis Fed president argued policy should remain moderately restrictive until it's clear the central bank's goals are in sight. His comments come as a flurry of officials shared their outlooks amidst uncertainty. They included the Chicago Fed president, Austin Goolsbee.
Fiscal policy, geopolitics, all of those things. If it affects prices or it affects employment, then the law says we have to think about it. I don't tell you what to order at the restaurant. I just say, look, what are the prices and what is the menu? And if tariffs drive up prices, then we have to think about them.
Fed policymaker Austin Goolsbee speaking there. The Bank of Atlanta President Raphael Bostic also offered his opinion in an essay released on Thursday, forecasting 2 rate cuts in 2025, but noting that uncertainty around that projection has now risen.
Israel says Hamas has violated the Gaza ceasefire deal by handing over an anonymous body instead of one of the hostages. The IDF says the remains they were given were not those of Shuri Bibas, who was captured alongside her 2 sons in the October 7th, 2023 attacks. The spokesman for the UN Secretary-General, Stefan Dujarric, called for both parties to abide by the terms of the ceasefire.
The Secretary General reiterates his appeal to the parties to abide by their commitments to continue the full implementation of the ceasefire and hostage release deal. He urges the parties to the conflict to respect the remains of the dead and return them to their relatives.
The UN's Stefan Dujarric speaking there. If the two sides can't agree, the war could soon start up again, risking more deaths in Gaza and the lives of the remaining Israeli hostages. Bloomberg has learned the dispute comes as Saudi Arabia convenes a private summit to discuss a post-war Gaza plan to counter the US proposal to relocate Palestinians.
Citigroup is ending its workplace representation goals and removing requirements to interview candidates from diverse backgrounds. The lender cited pressure from the Trump administration as a reason for the changes set out in an internal memo from CEO Jane Fraser, seen by Bloomberg. As well as abandoning aspirational representation goals, the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion and Talent Management team will be renamed to Talent Management and Engagement.
There's another sign that UK consumers are feeling downbeat about the country's economic prospects. That's according to the latest research by market research company GfK. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
When it comes to the economy, pessimism is higher now than it was in the wake of recession a year ago. GfK's gauge of expectations over the next year came in at minus 31 this month, 7 percentage points weaker than February 2024. That's close to a 2-year low. The lack of confidence could be due to warnings of job cuts from firms bracing for increased payroll cuts in April, keeping households wary about spending real wage gains. It's a blow for the Chancellor Rachel Reeves as she pursues the growth that has eluded Labour in its first months in power. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
Those are your top stories this morning. In the markets right now, Chinese tech stocks surging to the most in 3 years after the earnings from Alibaba. You have MSCI China Index now up by 3.2% overall. A lot of speculation about the Bank of Japan that it would hike interest rates sooner rather than later after the consumer inflation accelerated in January in Japan. That saw benchmark Japanese yields touching a 15-year high earlier this morning, dampened down though after comments from Bank of Japan Governor Kazuo Ueda, and so you have the Japanese yen also weaker this morning, down 0.5%, so moving back to 150.41. Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index is stronger, 0.1%. Treasuries edging higher in Asia. Oil heading for its biggest weekly gain since early January, and gold holding steady near a record high. Those are the markets.
In a moment, we'll bring you more on the US plans for talks over Ukraine. Plus, it's been 30 years since the collapse of Barings Bank. And Caroline, you've been speaking to the former rogue trader Nick Leeson, who sparked its collapse. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. So Nick Leeson caused the collapse of the bank as a young man. He was 28 years old. He made so many headlines. The 233-year-old Barings Bank that was, a banker to the Queen, for example. Nick Leeson speaking to us, looking back at that period in his life, but also thinking a bit about deregulation and what the rollback of regulation here in the UK and elsewhere might mean. He had some very interesting comments for us. Some more in that conversation in just a couple of minutes. But first, let's turn to our top story this morning. Donald Trump upending US policies on Ukraine and on Gaza. On Ukraine, the US has signalled that sanctions relief for Russia could be on the table in talks over ending the conflict. Meanwhile, negotiations for the second stage of the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel are due to start today as well. With the details, here's Bloomberg's EMEA News Director Rosalind Matheson. Ros, good morning. With this talk of sanctions relief, is it a sign that Washington and Moscow are actually going to negotiate an end to the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, it certainly does seem that way. It's interesting to see, to some extent, the US lay out a bit of its cards even before proper negotiations begin or there's a meeting directly between the leaders of US and Russia. But as you say, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent indicating in an interview on Bloomberg television that definitely sanctions would be on the table. And that's certainly something we've seen Russia indicate it wants to be part of the conversation. They keep alluding to it with talk of economic measures, the status of their economy with the US. So certainly seems to be something that they're very keen to happen. The question is, in the meantime, does the US perhaps slow down simply the enforcement of sanctions on Russia to try and ensure that Russia does indeed get to the table in negotiating a war at the end of the war in Ukraine. But obviously in all of this, the thing that stands out is we're talking a lot about US and Russia, but there's very little that we know about where Ukraine sits in all of this. And again, the question is, do the US and Russia strike a whole lot of understandings about how to end this war and then only then bring in Ukraine to the conversation?
Yeah, it's quite a change, isn't it? Russia has been a pariah. Vladimir Putin has been a pariah for so many years. So a real kind of change. The US envoy Keith Kellogg, though, did meet Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, who said that his team is ready to work with the US. Is there a sign that the Ukraine will be listened to? There's been such animosity. Are these talks, as they progress, will Ukraine be spoken to? Will they be involved?
Well, they did meet yesterday, as you say, but some of the parameters around the meeting were interesting. The US said that they didn't want to have any joint briefing afterward or statement to the media. And Zelensky said afterward in a post on social media that Ukraine is ready for what he called a strong, effective investment and security agreement. So that shows again that Ukraine is, of course, willing to talk to the US and wants to be part of the conversation, but also wants to sign up to an agreement that it sees as strong and effective involving the US. And there are reports overnight that the US has come back to Ukraine with a further proposal which would see the US getting access to some of Ukraine's critical minerals, and that's, the US says, to compensate it for its military support for Ukraine and for further support in the future. So perhaps there has been some movement there, but underlying all of this, given the comments we've seen this week, both from the US president and in response from Volodymyr Zelensky, that relationship remains exceptionally fraught.
Meanwhile, France's Emmanuel Macron is due to meet Donald Trump on Monday in Washington. He said that we want peace in Ukraine, but not a capitulation. Can European leaders, and he's only one of them that's going to be going to Washington, get a hearing in the White House on this issue?
Well, it probably depends on what they're bringing to the table. As you said, there's other leaders going there next week, including the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and we know from our own reporting that he's being advised to increase defence spending in the UK to 2.5% of output. That's only up from 2.3%, but it's a bit. And so you might see, both Starmer and the French President Emmanuel Macron talking up their plans to increase their own defence spending for Europe to become much more self-reliant when it comes to defence, so assuring Donald Trump they're taking him seriously on that. But then there's the separate question and the more immediate one, which is how can they again get into the conversation around the future of Ukraine? And we know it's possible that both Macron and Starmer will go to propose what they call a reassurance force, where Europe will provide some troops, largely surrounding Ukraine, not in Ukraine itself, but to help, for example, in the question of how do you create safety in the skies in the event of any kind of ceasefire.
OK. Away from Ukraine, let's think about the Middle East. We've had the news out of Israel that it says that one of the bodies handed over by Hamas was not the hostage that the group claimed that it was. What's that going to mean for the negotiations over prolonging the ceasefire?
Well, it's coming at a delicate time, as you say, because we are going into potentially the next stage conversation around this ceasefire, which is to A, extend it, but B, also to come into the conversations around, more fundamentally, what does the future of Gaza look like? And those are going to be very, very delicate conversations. So we've seen already several times throughout this ceasefire that it's been at risk almost of breaking down. There's been disputes over these exchanges that have gone on, and there's another one due to come tomorrow. So the question is whether this becomes an issue to the point that the Israeli government says, well, hang on, the ceasefire is not working and we're going to walk away. We do think at this point that they're likely to try and hold these talks. But again, at that point, you're coming at it from very, very different perspectives. Israel insists that Hamas be both demilitarized and removed from power, whereas Hamas says, yes, it's okay to talk about ceding control of Gaza, but it doesn't want to have to lay down its weapons. And then you end up with a situation a bit like Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example. So there are fundamental sticking points to any next stage conversation, and these latest developments just add a further element of tension into those.
OK, Rosalind Matzler, our EMEA News Director, thank you very much.
Now, it's been 30 years since Barings Bank, Britain's oldest merchant bank, collapsed after 28-year-old star trader Nick Leeson racked up $1.4 billion in trading losses in Barings' Singapore office. Leeson became the face of financial misconduct. He served more than 4 years in prison. Then he wrote a book that became a Hollywood movie. For the past few decades, Leeson's been on the speaker circuit talking about what he calls the most embarrassing time in his life. And more recently, he's been working to investigate financial misconduct. I spoke to Nick Leeson alongside our finance reporter Will Shaw, and I began by asking him for his perspective now, 30 years on, as he continues to talk about what he did.
Look, it's a very real story. It happened. There's no way that you can avoid that. Unfortunately, you do see certain facets of it coming back into not always just the financial services industry. I think, businesses and industries outside of the world of finance have had to pick up on compliance, risk management, government. You've got huge failures over the last number of years, Carillion and episodes such as that. So everybody's had to up their game in that regard. I don't specifically go into these organisations and try to give advice. I feel a bit fake if that was the process. I go in and I tell stories. I can go through in fairly close detail or extensive detail about what happened during that period, because nobody really knows it better than me. And if that then leads them to look at something quite differently within their organisation, then I think that's of a benefit. I also colour compliance and risk management parts of learning within those organisations, because it's usually fairly dull and most people try not to attend. So bringing me in makes sure they get a few more bums on seats, and there's a reason to why you're learning this and why you need to do this properly.
If there is another Nick Leeson out there now, what would you say to him or her?
Stop. It's not worth it. I remember doing a Treasury management conference in the Barbican a good few years ago now, and one treasurer came over to me and he said, look, I'd like to ask a piece of advice. And I started off by saying, I'm not sure I'm the right person for that, but I'll do my best to respond as honestly as I can. And he said, there's a bit of an issue, and it was for one of the biggest UK banks at the time. He said, I've got a bit of an issue. I'm not happy with something that's going on within the organisation. I've got an email in my outbox that I want to send, but I just don't have the courage to send it at this time. What do you think I should do? And I said, look, I don't know the specific instance, but the one piece of advice I can give you is it's far easier to get another job. It's not so easy to get another reputation, and you've got to make the right decision on that basis. Unfortunately, my reputation might be slightly different than it was back in 1995 when the story came to everybody's attention, but it's still a bad reputation.
That's interesting that you feel that you're still very much stuck with, even though you did the prison time, and it's a long time ago, you still feel that you're really saddled with it. Yeah,
I think people have asked me if I'm comfortable or content with that particular period of my life. I never will be. Because it's the complete opposite of what I wanted to achieve. Am I content with myself? Yes. What I represent, my family values and everything else, but the focus is very different. It's not on being successful and succeeding within the world of finance, which is what I wanted to do. So you have to change your focus a little bit, and that enables you to move forward, whereas speaking about it so openly, honestly and regularly means that it's not this big ogre that follows me around all of the time. It's part of my life. It's part of who I am today, but it doesn't quite have the level of shame, guilt and embarrassment as it did years ago, but it still has a certain amount of embarrassment.
Do you feel like systems and controls are better now, and that there are more safeguards in place to prevent this kind of thing?
Yeah, 100%. Like I speak at lots of different events and conferences where, compliance, risk management, governance are the theme, and you can't underestimate how many people work in those areas now. Like when I think back to my time at Barings, we had one compliance officer. I think she was also the risk manager for 2,500 people. You walk into most offices now in Canary Wharf or around this area, and there's 3,000 people working in compliance. So, it's come on in massive leaps and bounds since that time. The quality of people are better. They're better educated. They're getting better training within those organisations. But when you still have an episode like Macquarie happening within the last 2 years, where there were 450 fictitious trades, you have to question how on earth that happens.
And now, I suppose the Trump administration is looking to deregulate quite fast. There's potentially new risks going to emerge around things like AI and crypto. I mean, do you worry about the regulatory environment and the level of risk?
I don't worry for me. Maybe I think there's a worry for the markets. There's always these niche areas that throw up anomalies. So you've got, you had the episode with Archegos a few years ago. You've got Credit Suisse, who've gone by the wayside over the last number of years. You've got this thing that's happened with Macquarie. So is it 100% safe? Absolutely not.
But we're also we're at an interesting point, aren't we, in terms of the Trump administration wanting to roll back the financial crisis era regulations, and that is going to surely put pressure on the UK and on Europe to do the same. And for Britain, it's very much about trying to, financial services has been quite unloved for around Brexit and for quite a long time. Now it's perhaps needed in order to boost economic growth in Britain. So, is there a concern that is, going to become more of a dominant theme again? How do you get a grip of that?
Well, I think the elastic band went too far in the opposite direction when you had the global financial collapse and you've got Dodd-Frank and everything else that came in around that time. The controls were just too much, and that restricted a lot of business getting done. And I think, there's definitely a need to pull back a little bit on that. And you've seen that happen over the last number of years. Whether you're going to go to full deregulation, quite how far it's going to go, is going to open certain doors to allow things to go wrong again. And you've got to be very, very careful when people talk about deregulation. That throws me back to that period in 1987 when I was starting in the city, and it was all of that opportunity. The opportunity to move into the city, get jobs, move on within the different organisations, but also the controls, the systems weren't good enough. If you're getting that right, and the industry is perfectly safe, then deregulate and pull back on some of that regulation. But Macquarie is the one that worries me. How can you have 450 fictitious trades? It is just so basic an oversight. This is like kid stuff. And yet you've got an organisation that's missed 450 trades.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.